and welcome to Smarter, Richer, Braver, the podcast that's specially curated for you, a generation of young people who want to step up, stand out, and live life on their own terms. A generation who aim to do better, not just for themselves, but for humanity as a whole. A generation who aim to be smarter, richer, and braver, because that's exactly what the world today needs. I'm your host, Marilyn Pinto, author and founder at KFI Global, and I'd like to warmly welcome all you Gen Zers. A special shout out to all our KFI Global students listening in. Please know that this podcast was made with you in mind, and I promise it's going to be worth your attention.
This podcast is strictly for those 25 years and younger. If you are older than that, please listen at your own risk. Common side effects include regret and anger for not having heard this earlier in your life.
Learning about money is interesting for sure. But there's one aspect I find particularly intriguing, the link between money and happiness. You see, many of us grown-ups go off chasing money, thinking and believing that more money always equals more happiness. But it's not as straightforward as we might think. This episode is going to delve into this very nuanced and highly fascinating topic. Our guest today is Andrew Hallam, personal finance journalist, speaker, and international best-selling author. Andrew has spoken at businesses and schools in over 30 countries. He has a holistic view of wealth and success that I think is incredibly important for you to learn from. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Andrew, could you tell us what are some of the common myths that people have about money and happiness?
Well, I think people believe that the more money we have, the happier we are going to be. And so people often pursue money for the sake of money instead of thinking, what's the end reason we would be pursuing money in the first place? And so when we think about the end reason, often if you continue to ask people why they want to pursue it, they'll say they want to be happy. But then if they ever actually looked into the research on happiness to determine what are the aspects that actually make us happy and to what extent does money have serious limitations with respect to that? And we don't think so much about that.
And in your book, Balance, you talk about the 4 quadrants of a successful life. Can you delve deeper into this for us?
Well, obviously money is something that we do need. So money is one of the quadrants. And I think of success as like a 4-legged table. We need enough money. Absolutely. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't. For sure we do. We need our health. So we must make sure that we look after ourselves. And it's tough to be happy and successful when we don't have that. Our relationships are key. That's the most important component. And then a sense of purpose, that thing that gets you up in the morning, the thing that gets you excited to live. So those are the 4 quadrants to a happy / successful life. And you'll notice that I use those 2 words synonymously because success, when you ask someone why they want success, ultimately it is so that I can be happy. And so I'll often use those words synonymously because many people will use, I believe, success incorrectly. They'll say that person's really successful because she owns her own law firm and she has a mansion on the hill. Okay, so she may have been somewhat successful with respect to her career. But when we boil down why we want success ultimately so that we can have high level of life satisfaction. So again, I come back to that level or that overall holistic way of looking at success and looking at money.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I've realized that the mindset that we have around money is a crucial aspect to consider, right? And I think that deserves special attention because it profoundly impacts our financial well-being and by extension, our overall quality of life. What mindset would you like to see these youngsters cultivate? How should they be thinking about and relating this to the values that they have?
I think that they would look at, what do you want to be in the end, at the end of the day in terms of your level of contentment. So based on your actual personal values, who do you want to be at the end? And think, what I like to think is a little bit like there was a writer named Stephen Covey who said, think with the end in mind. So, with respect to that, imagine your own funeral. And what are people going to be saying about you? If you gave everybody truth serum, when you go to a funeral and people are speaking about you, everybody's just going to say the nice things. But if you had given everybody truth serum and they were to say what they liked and respected most about you, and literally you were to think about this and then write down these things that you would want them to say, those things would truly reflect what your values are. And so they would be things like Marilyn was a kind person. Marilyn listened to me. Marilyn looked at me when we spoke. The things that people won't be coming up with is Marilyn was amazing. She drove a Ferrari. And once we recognize what our true values are, and we do recognize them when we think about our own death, I know it sounds really weird,
Yeah.
but you try to project your actual death because at some point we're all going. Some of us will go in our 20s, 30s, 40s, hopefully most of us well into our 80s or 90s, but we don't know. So thinking with the end in mind allows us to see, well, what kind of person do we really want to be? And let's work backwards from that and become that person now, because that's the person that truly reflects our values.
That makes so much sense, even though it is a morbid way of thinking about it, but I can completely see the sense in that. You've spoken to and taught so many people around the world how to manage their money better. What are the top three money mistakes that you see that many adults make?
Consumer debt is the biggest. So people buying things that they can't afford. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that they can't acquire them. We can acquire things with a credit card. You can acquire almost anything you want if you have a decent job. You can acquire almost anything you want with a loan, a car loan or a consumer loan. However, then you're stuck with debt. And the research suggests that debt equals misery. And so we do things backwards. Instead of saving up enough money to buy something, we buy something and then later we pay for that thing, which ends up mitigating or at least to an extent, making it far less satisfying over time because debt does actually drag us down. Whether we realize it or not, the research suggests that that happens. Second is not investing money early enough. So, investing money for our future is very important. When we start investing money for our future at a young age, we can actually get away with investing less over our lifetime if we start early and we allow compound interest to do its thing. Third, I would say it's poor investment decisions. So those would be the three biggest mistakes: consumer debt, not investing early enough, and poor investment decisions.
And poor investment decisions. All right. In your book, you also talk about some interesting research that shows that savers are more desirable dates than spenders. Can you enlighten our audience on this aspect?
I was fascinated by this research when they were looking at university students and asking, the researchers wanted to find out, who do we really want to date? Who do we really want as partners in a relationship? And so they ended up showing people photographs and profiles. So assume that you're the subject and you're looking for a date, and they show you photographs of people, and then they would show you along the face of the individual, they would show you a bit of a profile, some of the things that they are interested in. And in some cases, they would have asked a very direct question. In other cases, they would be more indirect and they would ask the person to answer, like, what would you do if you won $100,000 tomorrow? And so then it would be more implied because the person might say, well, I would go out and I would buy a Mercedes Benz. Anyway, they got to see a variety of different responses. And they did the same kind of thing one on one, where they did almost like a personal speed dating
Like a
session
speed dating
where you
thing.
sat
Okay.
exactly. And the people were actors, obviously. And so, we had the actual subjects who were picking who they would date among a series of people who were pretending to be someone else. And so when they conducted the experiment over time, they would mix the person up. And what the researchers found was that people actually preferred those who were responsible with money to those who were less responsible with money. And that is something that I might expect maybe if you were looking at single people in their 40s, but to see that university students We're already wired to that point where I don't know whether it's a subconscious element, but they chose the people who were more responsible with money.
It intuitively makes sense, but you're right. You don't think that somebody so young can start thinking about that already, but it does make a lot of sense. We live in a world where consumerism is all around us, and we're constantly bombarded with messages encouraging us to buy this or that to achieve happiness. But the truth is, not all purchases are created equal when it comes to enhancing our happiness, are they? Can you fill us in on what sort of purchases actually enhance our happiness?
Purchases that bring people together enhance happiness. Experiential purchases, for example. So if you had, let's say, $10,000 and you spent it on a thing, a material acquisition, a purse, for example. The purse doesn't, I mean, the purse has a certain amount of utility. You're able to carry things with it. You may feel, some people may be quite excited. Oh, I have this lovely name brand purse. But the purse doesn't create a memory and the purse doesn't bring people together. Whereas if you spent that $10,000 by taking two or three friends on a little mini vacation somewhere, this is the extreme example. It's called an experiential purchase. Maybe then you went somewhere, you enjoyed some experiences together that you thereby building memories
Wow.
from, doing
Think
fun
of the
things
stories
together
you'd have, right?
for a lifetime. For a lifetime, you have these wonderful stories. Life is all about the stories. It's not about the stuff. It's about the life you build through the stories.
So the purchases we make should have some story factor in them, something that's memorable and that it's the stuff stories are made of, right?
Exactly. If that story factor brings people together, if it's something you purchase or spend money on that brings people together, that's the magic.
Could you, for the sake of our young listeners, explain the difference between saving and investing and why both are essential for building wealth over time?
Is for something that you are going to be immediately purchasing or paying for. So it's something that might be something that you will be buying within the next 4 or 5 years, within the next 4 or 5 years. And that might be a down payment for a home, for example. And so you're putting money aside in some kind of savings account for a home purchase so that you qualify for a loan or saving money for your education. The thing is that it's going to be something that you're going to be purchasing, or it's something that you're saving up for emergencies, money that you might need at any given time. Investing is different. When we invest money, we are hoping that money grows over time so that we can use it at a much later date. So something 5 years into the future and beyond.
So a much longer time horizon.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense. In your book, you also mentioned, and I love this bit, the desert island litmus test. What is this and how can these youngsters use this?
It's the idea that when we purchase something, are we really buying it for us or are we buying it to impress other people? So if I think about the deserted island litmus test, I think about, let's take an example of a fancy car. And let's say you'd love to have a Porsche. Now, have you bought it for me or for yourself, or have you bought it for somebody else? And the deserted island litmus test is quite simple. If you lived on a deserted island and no one could see that car, would you still own it? If you bought it for yourself because you love German engineering, you love the idea of having a Porsche, you love the way it shifts and it feels and it corners and it accelerates, and you truly love the automobile for you, you would still buy that Porsche if you lived on a deserted island and nobody could see it. And if you're really honest with yourself and you ask that question, would you still buy it if no one could see it? And if the answer is no, then you're buying it for somebody else. We don't love people because of what they drive. We don't respect people because of what they drive. We respect people because of who they are as people. And funny enough, it's often the opposite. We're actually often jealous of people who have something really expensive that we don't have. And jealousy is not a good thing because in a lot of ways, it's the opposite of love. It's sort of a bit of resentment. And so it is quite interesting how many will buy something thinking that others will see them in this certain light. They'll like them more, they'll respect them more, but it simply is not true.
This podcast isn't meant to entertain you. It's meant to help you do life better by showing you how to think about and navigate important issues that aren't usually talked about to youngsters. But we believe that you need to hear this because it has the potential to change your life and the lives of other young people like you. So please share this episode with someone you care about, and if you haven't already, please hit the follow button. It helps us get these meaningful insights and messages in front of more youngsters.
I think Morgan Housel talks about this in his book, right? Psychology of Money, where he says, if you drive up in a car, you're not impressing anybody. They're just imagining themselves in the car.
That is so, so true. And these things are massively depreciating assets. So spending more money than you need to spend on a fancy pair of shoes or a fancy purse or a fancy car, when that entity is a depreciating asset, meaning most of the time, 10 years down the road, it's worth significant, or 5 or 2, or it can be worth significantly less than what you paid for it. And so as a depreciating asset, it is one of those mistakes that most adults, they will purchase something that costs more than they should really be paying. And that money could be put towards savings and or investing for the future and or experiences that they can enjoy with people that they love, bringing it back again to stories and memories.
And this relates very closely to our next question. You say cars are the biggest source of debt. Could you talk to our audience, considering they're all youngsters about to get their new car in a year or two? Can you talk to our audience about this? What advice would you give them in this regard?
I would say, especially when you're young, buy the lowest cost car that you can. And obviously, we want it to be somewhat reliable, yes, but buy something as simple. Think of it as transportation and don't get caught up in the hype of paying more than you should for a vehicle.
I want to talk a little bit about the buy now, pay later schemes, which seem to have, risen in popularity, the BNPL. What are some of the common misconceptions or myths about these BNPL schemes?
To be fair, I don't even really know all that much about them. So I think of just borrowing money, getting a loan,
Yeah.
or putting money on a credit card. And when we do that, when we look at happiness research suggests that paying money for something up front enhances our life satisfaction much more so than acquiring the thing and then paying for that later. So when you
Really?
look at research done, yes, research done at Harvard by Michael Norton and another author named Elizabeth Dunn, and I reference this in my book Balance, they said that acquiring something before you pay for it does not enhance life satisfaction because it leaves you with a bad taste. It leaves you with the debts, it leaves you with the payments. Whereas if you pay for something up front, your level of life satisfaction is increased, regardless of whatever it is that you buy. Whereas if you are paying as you go, or if you are even worse, paying for something later, and I think that's really what we're talking about here,
Yeah.
is experiencing it and then paying for it after the fact, like a layaway plan or whatever that is. The acquire now, pay later types of schemes that we're talking about here actually reduce life satisfaction.
Okay, I'd like to move on to the next question. You say that close relationships are the single greatest influence on a happy life. Apparently, it's an even better predictor of happiness, health, and longevity than IQ, social class, and even genetics. Can you talk to us a little more about this?
There's a study that started about 90 years ago called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And they started to research a series of Harvard students and then extended that to a series of inner city men in poor areas. And over time, the study has extended, obviously, to include women and then to include the children of those people and now their children. And it's based on a series of self filled out questionnaires and then questions where they'll ask friends and family members about the actual subjects. And what they wanted to find was, what is it that leads to a happy life? Is it money? Is it professional success? Is it genetics? The researchers have found that the greatest variable for a happy life, and again, I come back to that word where I say happy and should be synonymous with success. Why do we want to be successful? So we can be happy. So let me just word it a different way. The greatest variable to a successful life is your relationships. So friendships, connections with other human beings is the greatest single variable to happiness.
I agree. Okay, I'd like to switch gears here for a minute. Many of our listeners are at a crucial juncture in their life where they are deciding their future career path. What advice do you have for teenagers who are undecided about what they want to do?
I love your question. I love that one. And I have a fairly unconventional answer. And it involves asking questions. Have you ever read the book, Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People? It was written in the
Yes,
1930s.
of course. Yes.
You have read it.
Yes.
So it's a classic. Fundamentally, to boil it down simply, is that people actually do like to talk about themselves. And so if you're trying to figure out or you're trying to learn about different professions, ask people questions. What do you do? Oh, how do you like that? How did you get into that position? It is surprising how much information people will give you. People love to talk, and especially, I think, Marilyn, in today's day and age, very few people actually like to listen. And because people don't listen, there are more talkers than there are listeners. Talkers are almost deprived of a keen ear. When we meet someone who's genuinely interested in our story and how we got to be who we are, how we got to our certain profession, perhaps more than ever, we are super keen to share our information and to help that person out because we love to talk about the process.
So, what you're saying is let these students talk to people in different careers, ask them all sorts of questions, and glean from their answers whether this is something they would like to do. Am I understanding that correctly?
Exactly. And I'm not necessarily meaning walk into a law firm and ask a lawyer. Talk to as many people as you can on the street. Hey, how are you? Starting conversation. Just it could be a friend. So how did you get into that? And I think just learning about these different things will also allow us to figure out what we might or what might be worth pursuing for ourselves based on us asking these kinds of questions. And it's more than just how much money do you make, but
Yeah.
let's get down into it. People
Yeah.
ultimately love to talk. As Dale Carnegie said, people love to talk about themselves and their careers. And if you show
Yeah.
genuine interest based on
True.
genuine curiosity, it is amazing how much information you will get from people. And you can make
Mm.
much, much better decisions when you're equipped with this information with respect to what career you might want to pursue.
I think that's great advice. And in fact, there was something else that I came across in your book, and I really wanted to ask you about this. Could you talk a little bit about some of the factors that you think students should consider about whether an elite college is a right fit for them personally and academically? Because there's been so much conversation around this, and I really love your take on this.
Oh, yeah, that is again such a paradox
Yeah.
where people often think, well, if I go to Yale or Harvard, I will ultimately end up with a better career and I'll have more money. Ultimately, well, I'll be more successful. What does more successful mean? Well, I'll get a better job. What does that better job mean? Well, I'll have more money. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. Now let's have a look at the actual variables with respect to research. And so there has been some fascinating research done on this where they tried to isolate the variable as to whether it's the college itself that enhances people's professional quote success or financial success. And they found that, first of all, if you look at graduates from Yale, Harvard, Stanford, yes, they earn more money than graduates from less prestigious schools. But is it the college itself that was the variable allowing them to earn more money? Or was it the type of student that gets into those colleges? So, what the research did was looked at students that went into prestigious Ivy League colleges, how much money they ended up earning at different stages of their careers. So, at the very beginning, and then during their peak earning years, which is usually in somebody's early 50s, and then looking at how much money they actually have. And they compared them to people who went to less prestigious colleges. But to isolate the variable, they wanted to see which were the people that actually, for some reason or another, turned down an Ivy League education that they did indeed qualify for. So they were smart enough to get to Harvard or Yale or Stanford, but for some reason chose not to and went to a less prestigious college. So the research tracked those people. And what they ended up finding was that in the peak earning years, there was no difference between the level of income or wealth that the students had who went to less prestigious colleges versus the students that went to the Ivy League colleges when looking at the college itself as the isolated variable. So it had more to do with the individual and less to do with the college.
I love that answer. I think that really clears that up. Okay. What are a few things that you recommend young people do that would better prepare them for adulting? I know you have a couple of recommendations in your book. If you could just give us just two or three.
Preparing them for adulting, many of the things that I've already talked about, because I think a lot of the preparation is this mental preparation of knowing that the material things that you're also the material acquisitions you buy do not enhance your level of life satisfaction. So let's do better and be better than the average adult. And I think that's a great way to start out. The bar isn't as high as you think. Take the pressure
Exactly.
away and recognize that the average adult is a bit of a doofus, right? And that's the fun part of it. Like recognize that the average human being is actually and does conduct themselves counterintuitively or unproductively with respect to overall life satisfaction and therefore success. So the bar
Yes.
isn't very high. Don't be like everybody else. Don't follow the patterns of consumption that so many people have fallen into. And recognizing that, first of all, I think is huge, huge with respect to the idea of actually successfully adulting. The second part, too, is learn a little bit about investing. So I had to learn something most people didn't know. I had to become financially literate. I had to be able to think for myself. I had to realize that chasing material acquisitions and expensive things doesn't necessarily enhance my life satisfaction. But saving money at an earlier age than most and having that money compound over time has made me rich. I was able to do a career that I enjoyed, which was teaching. Teaching to me was it was so much fun. Just going to work each day was a blast. I remember thinking, wow, this is great. I can't believe they pay me for this. But because I had established financial literacy at a young age and I started investing at a young age, I was able to save less than a lot of people who earn much higher incomes than me, while in the end having much, much more money than them in the end. So it's not like I had to deprive myself, but I started investing at a much earlier age. And I think those elements are really, really, really important for people to recognize as they go into adulthood.
That is such a great message. And we're going to stop there because I know you have so much to get back to. Andrew, thank you so much for doing this. And thank you for all the advice that you've given. I'm sure this is going to be super helpful to all our listeners. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, Marilyn. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you for listening. I want to help you use what you learned here. And the best way to do that is to get a podcast buddy. That's someone who also listens to this podcast. Then talk to your podcast buddy about the one takeaway from this episode that resonated with you the most. That's it. That's all you have to do. Remember that much of what is talked about on this podcast is stuff that's not typically talked about to young people, and it should be. It's stuff that you need to know so that you can lead a life that's, you guessed it, smarter, richer, and braver. This is your host, Marilyn Pinto, signing off. Until next time.
If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to broach in our upcoming episodes, please email us at smarterricherbraver@gmail.com. And if you'd like to sign up for one of our award-winning programs, go to kfi.global and check out our upcoming schedule.